We're going to continue with the conference with the third speaker. This is Moritz Herrmann. The title of his paper is "The Concave Mirror Experiment: Lacan's First Revision of Kant's Transcendental Aesthetics." So please, Herrmann, Moritz.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. First of all, thank you, Lorenzo and Tadej, for having organized this. And sorry for being so late and therefore to miss the first discussion. Actually, I think there might be some echoes both between what I'll say and the two other respective talks, but we'll come to that in the Q&A maybe. I'll begin by two quotes. The first one is from Freud. It's a note which he wrote down in his very last notebooks called Findings, Ideas, and Problems from 1938. Space may be the projection of the extension of the psychical apparatus. No other derivation is probable. Instead of Kant's a priori determinants of our psychical apparatus, psyche is extended, knows nothing about it, weiß nichts davon. The second quote is from Lacan. Surprisingly, philosophy has not been more interested in the question of spatial orientation since Kant, holding his glove at the end of his hand, based an aesthetics on it. An aesthetics that is nevertheless just as simple to turn inside out as the glove itself. When it comes to Lacan's reading of Kant, with very few exceptions like that of Bernard Bass, commentators focus mostly on the relevance of Kant's critique of practical reason and the way psychoanalysis pursues but also potentially modifies or cuts across the epistemological and ontological coordinates of such a precursory ethics of the real. Without denying the relevance of such discussions about an ethics of psychoanalysis, I simply contend that another part of Lacan's engagement with Kant has, if not been overlooked completely, at least been underappreciated or dismissed as circumstantial or negligible. This other part of Lacan's critical engagement with Kant refers to the critique of pure reason in general, thereby including Kant's positioning vis-à-vis modern Galilean Newtonian science, as well as the transcendental analytic in a broad sense, but in particular to the transcendental aesthetics. Even within Kant's final opus posthumum, such a transcendental aesthetics was thought by Kant to provide the, quote, key to transcendental philosophy, unquote. Which makes sense if we consider that the opening exposition of space and time as pure forms of our sensibility and corresponding general forms of subjective appearances decisively subverts the classical ontology's application of pure categories to things in general. It does so by putting space and time, so to speak, transcendentally between our subjective categories or language and things in general, which are then instead merely thought by Kant as things in themselves, with the emphasis on thought, thereby providing the relative content of the categories in synthetic judgments a priori that operate somewhere in an undisclosed location, so as to both necessarily and sufficiently condition our experience. Against first impressions, I claim that Lacan's take on Kant's first critique in general and on the transcendental aesthetics in particular is, when compared to his engagement with the second critique, philosophically far more challenging and far-reaching, both for philosophy itself as well as for a philosophically informed psychoanalysis whose relevance we are putting to the test in these days. And these 3 days, I'm saying. So, what does Lacan say with respect to Kant's transcendental aesthetics? And why is the transcendental aesthetics relevant to psychoanalysis in the first place? I think Lacan's answers to both of these questions, as well as Lacan's overall take on Kant's transcendental aesthetics, can be summarized or at least sketched in 5 minimal points. Point 1. First of all, before getting into any specifics, we may note that Lacan says so much that he believes there to be such a thing as a transcendental aesthetics. In other words, he assumes that there have to be specific formal, spatial, and temporal conditions in place for our experience to be possible, without necessarily being able to prove them in a conclusive manner. And indeed, transcendental reasoning never operates with proofs in the strong sense. Second point. Almost every time Lacan is commenting on Kant's transcendental aesthetics, and there are numerous of those passages, he is eager to immediately add that it is insufficient in the form presented by Kant. Such insufficiency might not be a complete one, since our everyday experience seems very well to rely on some properties of space exposed as such by Kant, like its three-dimensionality, continuity, homogeneity, etc. But Kant's transcendental aesthetics is insufficient if measured against psychoanalytic experience as it has historically emerged with Freud. In other words, as long as we have not made a psychoanalytic experience which necessarily passes through that of being an analysand and remains related to it even as an analyst, there is no reason for Kant's transcendental aesthetics to be revised. But once we have made that specific or even singular experience, which Lacan starts to conceptualize as a different experience of speech, Kant's transcendental aesthetics, Lacan says, quote, is not the good one, unquote, and consequently has to be, quote, substituted by something else, unquote. Third point. The problem with Kant's transcendental aesthetics as epistemologically conditioned by the existence of psychoanalysis as a practice can be linked to one of Lacan's larger objections against philosophy, about which we will certainly hear more about in the presentations that will follow. For my purpose, let me just note that, as Lorenzo will lay out on Friday, if there is something specifically and not just vaguely anti-philosophical about Lacan's conception of psychoanalysis, it is his firm stance against philosophy's claim for a being of the one. I think that Kant's transcendental aesthetics, as said in the introduction, subverts classical ontology's claim for the being of the one precisely by introducing the idea that the one is instead an operation without being. As per Kant, space and time as pure forms of sensibility operate, so we could say, a first non-conceptual count of any manifold of sensible representations that is a precondition for any conceptual or discursive countability of those representations as a manifold of an object in a synthetic judgment. On this side of the things, Lacan fully embraces Kant's critical or philosophical anti-philosophy qua one being. On the other hand, within the first critique itself, such a subversion of the being of the one is itself, if not contradicted, then at least considerably mitigated by an eventual relapse, not into a transcendent one being, but into the foundational one of the transcendental subject itself, which provides the ultimate ground for every discursive judgment in the form of an I think. What is more, as Heidegger correctly observed, the relationship of the transcendental subject to the aesthetics remain on a transcendental level wholly unclear, thereby introducing a gap into the critique which I would claim he cannot bridge and which even expresses or consolidates itself in the geometrical assessment of pure intuitions, although I cannot elaborate this point today. Fourth point. If we consign ourselves to this question of space, which I will do today, we can say that Lacan therefore undertakes a continuous revision of Kant's transcendental aesthetics, which I would claim entails three discontinuous moments or thresholds, of which only the latter two will eventually really bridge that gap. The first one is the concave mirror experiment, which I will present today, and which is introduced in the mid-1950s and most notably in Seminar 1. The second is the topology of surfaces or pointless topology from the early 1960s onwards. And the third is that of knot theories starting in the early 1970s. Fifth point. If each of those revisions is meant to be a revision of Kant's transcendental aesthetics, what is it then that has to be conserved from its structure? Quote from Lacan. I contend that invariantly through all these three revisions, this structure builds on the most fundamental distinction on which Kant's entire three critiques, or even his transcendental philosophy, hinges, that between concept and intuition, or more precisely, between the spontaneity of the general concept and the formal receptivity of a first unicity, which is general but non-conceptual as pure intuition. Why is this fundamental difference or even structure relevant for psychoanalytic thinking? Because it translates in Lacan's lexis into the important and also challenging assumption that there is something irreducible to the signifier, delimited by Kant as aesthetical or as aesthetics, which is nonetheless only emerging or re-emerging repeatedly in concomitance with the signifier. Or put differently, the aesthetics in question is only transcendental to the extent that it is flanked by the signifier or the symbolic, or in Kant's parlance, a transcendental analytic. I take this, although to varying degrees and in different forms, to be true of all three revisions I just enumerated. The concave mirror experiment formalizes the function of the small other, or the specific form of otherness that adheres to a specularized imaginary that is characteristic for us human animals and which emerges independently of the Oedipus complex, but despite it, persists in its aftermath. Second, the topology of surfaces formalizes, among other stuff, the small other as objet pitya, and in particular, the way in which it constitutes the vortex or whirl of the fundamental fantasy of the unconscious, thereby mediating between the real of the desire of the other and the symbolic. Third, Lacan's later knot theory can, for that purpose, at least tentatively, be considered as a sort of meta-formalization of those two previous formalizations, where the imaginary is granted a proper consistency on condition that it exists to the other two registers. That is to say, it holds only as such, only insofar the other two registers turn around it and vice versa, thereby implying a wedging, coinçage, between the three registers in which precisely is located l'objet pitya. As can be seen, the question of a revised transcendental aesthetics crucially revolves around the register of the imaginary without thereby being able or allowed to neglect the other two registers. So these were my 5 points. Now I transition towards the concave mirror experiment. Within my PhD, I thus will try to retrace that trajectory of Lacan's revision of Kant's transcendental aesthetics by starting with an explicitly geometrical account of what Lacan theorizes as specular space, in order to then delineate something within the imaginary which is not reducible to specularity and which can be formalized or schematized as such only by means of mathematical topology. As for today, I will therefore begin with the beginning, to quote Hegel, the concave mirror experiment, or what I also call Lacan's first revision of the transcendental aesthetics. Now, for the following, I'm drawing mostly on a chapter of my PhD, as well as on an article co-written with Paris Lavidis, also present here today. But for reasons of time, I have to summarize some of my arguments and also skip over a more detailed introduction and several ramifications of that matter. I brought to you 2 schemas, or let's say 5. The first one is the reduced schema, which you'll see there. I hope everybody can see it. The second one, I call it the basic schema, which is also known as optical schema, or as in a representation of the concave mirror experiment. And there's also a third experiment, I should add, or not an experiment, but a theoretical idea, namely that you have 2 concave mirrors, which then portray a position of intersubjectivity, or the specificity of psychoanalytic experience, as you have 2 subjects confronted with each other, although one of the 2 concave mirrors is dashed, so it's not a usual intersubjective situation. But for reasons of time and other, let's say, shortages, I'll confine myself to the first 2, that is to say the reduced schema and the full or basic schema. So now, I assume that at least in a minimal form, everybody is familiar with the mirror stage in a vague sense. Since usually the concave mirror experiment is considered to be something like a didactical representation of the mirror stage, and therefore not really worth a consideration on its own. Rather, I would like to show that what Lacan says about the concave mirror experiment with respect to the mirror stage is indeed very important, and he says 2 things at least. First, that it's a generalization of the mirror stage, and the second thing he says that it's showing us the limited use we can make of it. And hopefully, at the end of my talk, I will have somehow elucidated what this means. So in assuming everybody knows more or less what's the mirror stage, I will now present the concave mirror experiment from bottom to top, so as it were, with the reduced schema, which you can see here. So you see on the left side, that's called the experiment of the inverted bouquet, which existed before Lacan, and he draws it from Henri Boisse. And such experiment takes its clue from a spherical mirror, as such cut out of a sphere, or more precisely, an inwardly reflecting spherical and thereby concave mirror. Through such a mirror, the reflected light rays meeting its surface are not inflected at the degree of their entry angle, as in plane mirrors, but instead, if entering in parallels from infinity, gather towards a focal point where all light rays converge. Now, the said experiment from Boisse, on the left side, employs the particularity of such a mirror, which consists in the fact that by virtue of those different inflections, an object positioned above or below the mirror's symmetrical axis and at a certain distance from the mirror is reflected in such a way so as to appear vertically inverted in the corresponding so-called real image. Why is it called a real image? Because the reflected light rays coincide in a point in real space before they meet the eye of the observer, instead of diverging in the direction of the eye from a point behind the mirror in virtual space. So I will skip the discussion of the experiment of Boisse, which is not particularly relevant, but instead progress to Lacan's adoption of it, whereby he inverts the vase and the flower, which you can see. So according to Lacan's variant of this experiment, it is the vase that is hanging upside down in a box in a way that it is foreclosed to the direct vision of the observer. But given the properties of the concave mirror I described, this vase can be projected above in the box in a real image. The image can thus be seen precisely around this point where the light rays meet in real space, and the fact that there are flowers waiting for this image helps the eye to, as one says, accommodate this real image in real space. Furthermore, the conjunction of the real flowers and the real image of the vase creates the illusion as if the vase contained the bouquet of flowers. Before discussing the little touch Lacan adds to this experiment, namely the plane mirror through which this real image is reflected in a corresponding virtual image, let me proceed to a direct interpretation of this reduced schema with which Lacan introduces the concave mirror experiment in Seminar 1. I'll start with some basic equations, or generally, what is what. According to Lacan, the box in which hangs the vase and on which is installed the bouquet of flowers can straightforwardly be equated with, quote, your own body. Furthermore, the fact that the vase, as designating a more specific function of the body to be explored, is hidden inside the, so to speak, black box of the body, indicates, according to Lacan, the, quote, scant access the subject has to the reality of this body. In short, we are dealing here with the primordial, but not only primordial, helplessness from which suffers this child after the species-specific prematurity of birth, which immediately translates into a sensomotorial immaturity and a subsequent discordance or disarray in the organism's instinctual functions. Accordingly, the concave mirror itself, in my view, is not designating some general feature of specularity, as is sometimes believed. In fact, if Lacan repeatedly says that it represents some general function of the cortex, or even more specifically, the area striata of the occipital lobe, which with its fibrillary layers is like a mirror, unquote, this shall not mean that it is merely reducible to the existence of an organic visual apparatus, that is to say, the cortex plus the eyes, which as such is, of course, to be found in a large number of other non-human animals. And I think this is rather a specific experiment which aims at representing something for the human animal, or to the human animal. Instead, I contend that if indeed the baby possesses a refined visual perception, it first and foremost, the concave mirror, designates the species-specific prematurity of birth, which is equally described by Lacan ontogenetically as a discordance in neurological development, unquote, or anatomically speaking, and, quote, incompleteness of the pyramidal tracts, unquote. As for the flowers themselves, according to the Lacan from Seminar 1, they designate both the Freudian drive and the object of the drive, quote, as it walks around in the world, unquote. More to the point, the flowers in their undetermined collection in a bouquet are evocative of the psychoanalytic notion of the partial object. The relatively contingent list of which includes at least at first breast, fasces, and potentially the phallus, and as Lacan will add maybe later, voice and gaze. Indeed, Lacan theorized those partial objects in his earlier writings as privileged images or imagos. On the other hand, the gaping neck of the vase certainly evokes the corresponding bodily orifices which Freud called erogenous zones: mouth, anus, ears, and eyes. I need to shorten this discussion, which is complicated by Lacan's confusing and partly problematic discussion of the reduced schema in Seminar 1, but I contend that the illusory bodily unity provided by the conjunction of the real image and the flowers is primarily metaphorical in nature, and therefore not reducible to an image of visual perception. Neither, I would say, does the reduced schema in its totality, as is sometimes claimed, stand for primary narcissism before secondary narcissism, nor does it correspond to the mirror stage in which an actual infant beholds their image in an actual mirror. Given what I just said, it rather corresponds to what Lacan will later call the sexualization of need, which is due to the vital exposure of the child to the parental other, even if language is not thematized here. Or we could also say that it is the first model for what, in terms of Seminar 11, we can retroactively consider as the psychical representation of the drive circuit around its object. In this sense, it designates, at its most general level, the drive's split from the object of need or instinct, whereby the drive's henceforth sexualized object, whether it be the mother's breast or the child's own thumb or any other object suited for that purpose, is repeatedly surrounded or encircled by an orifice of the body like that of the baby's mouth. I think on this broad level, it could also be said to correspond to what Freud called the autoeroticism of the drive, which for Freud, in his best writings on that matter, precedes both temporally and logically narcissism and the ego, since, if considered ontogenetically against the backdrop of autoeroticism, narcissism as the libidinal investment of one's own body requires, as Freud has it, a new psychical action, whereas autoeroticism is, as he says, uranfänglich, primordially beginning. On the other hand, I would insist that this structural feature of the drive is not reducible to a mere stage of ontogenetical development, since the split of the drive from the object of need will persist through all later developments. For the same reason, I would claim that the observer for which this real image of an illusionary unity would appear never consistently occupies the position from which this image could be seen, since this position is not as sustainable as such, neither for the child nor for us, if it weren't for fantasy, and we might come back to that later in the discussion. Instead, such an aesthetics of the drive, I would say, will sustain itself only by means of an eventual redirection onto an imaginary or virtual object, qua object of desire or love, which is what we will witness in the extended or basic schema. In this sense, the reduced schema is not simply an ontogenetical stage preceding narcissism, but instead a formalization of a problematic form of the real that logically has to be presupposed for its imaginary reduplication in a virtual space to be possible, only to then be stabilized as such by positioning in the symbolic order, as we will later see. In other words, it corresponds to a pre- or even non-specular polymorphous aesthetics, if you wish, in the sense of aesthesis as a perception that doesn't rely on a unifying percipience, which is not as such transcendental, but will only have become such by means of a set of further conditions. So in order to get to this transcendentalization, if you allow me the term, let's proceed to the basic schema. As you can see, this schema has three forms. The first one above, second one here. You find those two in Seminar 1. And the third one which is to be found in the écrit, in the Remarques sur le rapport de Daniel Lagache, so from 1960, 6 years later, roughly. But I think actually what is presented here, in contrast to what is presented earlier schematically, is already present in Seminar 1, so I won't consider any differences in the development of Lacan's reading of the experiment itself. What we can directly see, actually, is that the first schema doesn't have a dotted line here corresponding to a second point in virtual space. The second one has one with VS standing for virtual subject. And the third one has a further designation here, namely the I, which he qualifies as the ego ideal. And we'll come to that later. Just in general, you see here the same, let's say, elements of the reduced schema on the left side, plus the plane mirror in the middle, and then the virtual image about which I already hinted here on the right side, thereby being a reduplication of the real image. So let me proceed. Let's ask the direct question. Does this plane mirror then represent the actual mirror in front of which the child recognizes the image of its own body? Are we thereby transitioning from autoeroticism to narcissism? Yes and no. Why is that? I will come back to this question soon after I have described what is happening through the introduction of the plane mirror on a formal level. Most basically, but crucially for the transcendental aesthetics, this plane mirror reduplicates or projects the real space on the left side onto the right side, and thereby redoubles the real space behind the plane mirror by a virtual space. This virtual space is only conceivable as such to the subjective position of an observer, which has, we could say, a stance in front of the mirror. With respect to the reduced schema, we are thus witnessing a change of perspective, whereby the observer no longer stares into the concave mirror, out of which an illusion emerges. Instead, staring into the plane mirror, which receives the reflected light rays of the concave mirror, the observer now sees a virtual image of both the real image and the real flowers. On condition that both the plane mirror and the observer are positioned correctly, so that the observer sees the light rays that are reflected in the plane mirror, the observer can thus sustain the illusion of a completed ideal image where apparently nothing is lacking. Therefore, the whole issue of this transcendental aesthetics will revolve around the relationship between the real space on the left side and the virtual space on the right side, as established only by the subjectivity of the observer. More precisely, only on condition that the observer positions itself within the cone and with a sufficient amount of distance from the plane mirror, are we dealing with, quote, a point-by-point adequation of the imaginary, qua virtual image, and the real, qua real image. In fact, if we assume the formal point of the imaginary, all points of the real space are biunivocally reflected or projected onto corresponding images or points in virtual space, without anything lacking in the reflection. And this biunivocal correspondence, I would say, specularizes the imaginary. But biunivocality as such is not sufficient for specularity, since it qualifies for Lacan as the general formal condition of images tout court. Instead, it has to be added that this biunivocal correspondence is as such an ideal one, which is why we could say that the subject necessarily is, in Kant's sense, a transcendental idealist, whereby this very peculiar form of adequation about which Lacan speaks in the remark, with the synthetic image of the other, alienates the subject in the ideality of the virtual space. But at the same time, such a formal or ideal correspondence is materially subverted by real space itself, or better, by the fact that the real image is not really real in the Lacanian sense. It rather corresponds to the illusionary unity in which the subject's ego believes itself to reside, as being distinguished from the outside world through the surface of its spherical body. Or we could also say that the real image is supposed to be real for a subject who sees it in a virtual image of the other, but at the same time this real image in itself is not real at all. And in fact, you see in all three presentations or schematizations, there is no real image on the left side to be seen as such, since it's relative to the position of an observer who would see it directly. For that reason, I contend that the major point of the concave mirror experiment resides in the determination of the conditions under which such an ideal correspondence between the virtual image and the real image can not only be established, but also consistently be maintained. Fundamentally, Lacan's answer is that there needs to be a second position or a point in virtual space from which the subject can unconsciously see itself as an ideal ego, and that such a point can only be subjectively occupied by means of a symbolic identification. Such a position will then ultimately be that of what Freud calls the ego ideal. Moreover, such a symbolic identification with this virtual position can dynamically be represented by the fact that the plane mirror can not only be inclined, but even be tilted by a 90-degree turn, bascule, so that the subject virtually moving along the axis of such a plane mirror can temporarily occupy this very position. To therefore come back to the question whether the plane mirror corresponds to the actual mirror of the mirror stage conceived ontogenetically, on the one hand, the answer is negative, since the fact that the plane mirror can be tilted or turned witnesses to the metaphorical character of the plane mirror. In this sense, the mirror stands for the fact that our abilities to see at all is conditioned by our position in the symbolic order, while simultaneously relating us to the small other with which we identify imaginarily. On this level, the concave mirror experiment shall therefore depict a post-Oedipal scenario or a more permanent structure of the imaginary of the subject, as stabilized through a symbolic identification. Therefore, it could be said to correspond to a transcendentalization of both what I've previously called the polymorphous aesthetics of the drive, which will then pass through a theory of fantasy, and the predominantly visual and specular aesthetics of the mirror stage. Along the same lines, I would argue that it is only once we've reached this level, and thus the third variant of the concave mirror experiment, that we can recuperate those aesthetics as also as preceding ontogenetical or diachronical stages. Since only once we have gained insight into the stabilizing function of the symbolic correspondence between two specific points in the diagram, that we can retrospectively consider the mirror stage as the stage in which such a stabilizing function lags. So that's the lag I was talking about earlier here. What is more, if we also consider the experimental character of the experiment, namely the fact that the position of the eye is not as static as depicted in the schema, but instead can be freely moved, such a lag potentially, or almost necessarily, translates into an inconsistency of the virtual image. Since the child has not yet fixed its position symbolically, the appearance of an image of an ideal body mastery is accompanied by the simultaneous emergence of a disintegrated image, or if you wish, an image of the body in bits and pieces. So if you have once put up the experiment yourself, you will notice that it's very difficult actually to really get into this position where the illusion somehow produces itself. And as soon as you slightly move, the flowers in the vase, they disintegrate, and the flowers somehow appear to be hanging in the air, as it were. But as the more distance you get to the plane mirror, the lesser this variability is. So the more consistent this image is in the end. From the perspective of a transcendentalized specular aesthetics, we can thus retrospectively say that in this derivative sense, yes, the plane mirror does indeed correspond to that of the mirror stage. Thank you. I've not talked about the second variant, but we might do that in the Q&A, but there might be other interests. So I leave that up to you.
So excellent. Thank you very much. I can try to talk in English.
Yes,
so in the seminar of the Angoisse, Lacan says we need another aesthetic than does what Kant speaks. It's very interesting because you know Ernest Mach. the physician, who make the drawing in which, if you, for example, if you design really that you see the computer, etc., you don't see the computer, only the computer. You see, including your nose, for example, or your mustache, etc. So it's interesting because in this optical schema, Lacan introduced that in the seminar 1, and precisely, very interesting point, apropos of what? Apropos of the case of the autism, the little Dick. So precisely a child for whom there is not the gaze of the other, because simply you can't, the infant, the autistic infant, can't share the gaze with the other. So this schema is repris in the 66, and is you show that in this schema that Lacan introduced precisely the gaze of the other. Please excuse me. I allow.
Yeah.
If you have
which one?
No. That's okay.
Yeah.
If you have if you want to have a really synthetic schema of this schema, is this one. So I did a bit for you. So the adult gaze, like ideal ego, the reality, a mirror or whatever you want, bullshit reality, etc. But the baby share with him, with the adult, before to see the reality, objective reality. So you can't put here the Kant bullshit, synthetic, a priori, etc. And here, in this sharing with the other, the objet petit a precisely. So that is the aesthetic that we need, we psychoanalysts. I don't know, maybe you're not, I don't know. But that is the aesthetic that we need, maybe. And that is the aesthetic that is bullshit aesthetic, Kant, etc. Okay, that is in the idea.
Thank
so
you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
But I have a question. Where within the schema itself would you present the second case? Yeah, but
this is the eyes of the adult.
Yeah,
the other, and it is the occipital lobe here. So your
okay.
Yeah.
So in your reading, the occipital lobe is the concave mirror, whereas the eye, which we can see in the schema, is that of the other, the parent.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, resonates also with these descriptions he gives in the remark, that the fact that the moment the child recognizes the image, it turns to its parents, and
Exactly.
yes.
Exactly the point. The key point is the child, when he recognizes himself on the mirror,
Yeah.
in fact, he turns his head
Yeah.
to the adult, for example. He shares with him this perception. Otherwise, you are lost.
Yeah.
You are autistic person.
Yeah, I think that's in general that's a limitation of the schema, that there is no place for the desire of the other. I think, and also not for language, properly speaking. Although the symbolic identification about which I was speaking happens through speech. But yeah, I totally agree. You would somehow need to think about the gaze as probably not being reducible to the point of the ego ideal. In a way, the way in which we see us through the ego ideal is already a suppression of this of the phantasmatic structure in a way, I would say. So yeah, I totally agree. Although I'm not sure whether it all holds if we consider the eye to be really that gaze. Because for me, the eye, in its very movability or flexibility, or by which you end up with the inconsistency of the virtual image, is for me very important as in terms of a subjective position. Yeah. And also the fixity. I mean, being fixed through a corresponding point in virtual space. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I think,
half direct, but and half only side remark to your talk. And by the way, fantastic! Really, thanks for that. A remark also in relation to the discussion that we have here right now, because on the very last schema, the barrier in between, it's even marked by A.
Yes.
So you have the big other there.
Yeah.
I'm telling this because you have, as you probably know, two kind of versions of mirror stage theory in Lacan. One is from the mirror stage essay, and it's more or less the way you described, and then there is a question whether you do have symbolic other there or do you have only gaze, because I think the gaze of the other is of secondary importance. For example, in the...
No, it is secondary important. Lacan said the purest moment of the stage mirror is fundamental.
Yeah, but at the same time, he revises the mirror stage theory in the seminar 10, where he says, the little child recognizes him or herself in the totality of the image, but what happens after that is he turns to the other, in order to gain ratification, the yes to this image, so to the signifier, not to the gaze of the other. The signifier is the confirmation that what he sees is right and true. So a retroactive.
Because the point is the possibility to share.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm working with Paris on an article about this, where we actually will go into all the developments of seminar 6, 8, and 10. Because in my PhD, I will focus on seminar 1 and draw from 1 or 2 things from the other seminars. But what we will want to go into is actually the way in which potentially the fantasy could be schematized in the concave mirror experiment itself. Namely by pinning somehow the wheel of the mirror itself, so you not just temporarily pass onto the other side in the virtual space, but you pinwheel the mirror constantly, thereby creating a superposition between the virtual image and the real image as not complete. And then you can somehow, think of the left side, which is a problematic form of the real, as a proto-form of that which will have been fantasy, if that makes sense somehow. But in that way, we could somehow, I think, reconcile the later reformulations of the mirror stage in seminar 10 with those earlier forms. And there are many other, or infinitely many other things one could say about the concave mirror experiment. But
what you just said in terms of rotating constantly the mirror, that would be moving with this, sublating this experiment into topology.
Yeah, that's quite literally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You can the reformulation of the torus, all of these issues actually maps.
Yeah, then the question comes in of demand, and precisely. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? It's a brutal one.
Not without the mic.
I have actually 2 questions. One is very quick, and I'm using the adjective brutal on purpose because we know you use it a lot. So the brutal question is,
please go.
Where is time in the concave mirror experiment? This is the brutal question.
Yeah.
And the opening up question, instead, going back to the beginning of your presentation, has to do with the sequence, which is very convincing. You outline in terms of understanding the 3 attempts that Lacan carries out to update Kant's transcendental aesthetics. So this is the first. Then you have topology, and then you have knot theory. You describe knot theory quickly as a meta-formalization.
Yeah.
And that is slightly problematic for me. So
I
I
know,
would like
I
to,
know, yeah.
because in a sense, one could say, but that would be reductive. One could say here we are still at an analogical level. Unless one does, like Moritz did, he spent like 2 weeks in the summer constructing that.
With fathers together,
That is already not analogical anymore. And then you have like the topological level, which is basically what we know about Lacan from the Taurus onwards. But then why would knot theory be a kind of a meta-formalization of the topological formalization? Because then the problem would be, how do you square up a meta-formalization, if there is such thing, in knot theory, with what is the matheme, which by definition is instead a formalization of an impasse of formalization.
Yeah.
Because the two things do not go together. One is a meta formalization, and the other one is the impasse of, it's the formalization of the impasse of formalization. So, and then I'll stop, but it might be the case that in a sense, like, I mean, why is not theory necessary beyond topology? The blunt question, but I think the blunt issue, I'd say, but I think this is very important for the latest Lacan, is that Lacan realizes that he always treated the imaginary as a shit order. And instead he needs knot theory to actually say the imaginary is not the black swan of the orders. And this is somehow lost in topology by definition, because it's a distraction of a Kantian imaginary.
Although you have an embedding of those topological figures in our imaginary space, no? And he doesn't consider them as pure formalizations which you just write down, but you by plunging them or embedding them in our three-dimensional imaginary space, the link still, or I mean even the difference, I would say, is introduced in the imaginary. But let me come back to the, by order, to the issue of time first. Where's time here? I think the way I presented it, time is only negatively present either, I mean, as a difference between those three stages, which we can recuperate once we have reached the transcendental level, or as a dynamic within each stage as per experiment, moving of the eye, etc. But then I think in the end, Lacan himself is not really content with this answer, which is why, if one really wants to go all the way systematically with the transcendental aesthetics, of course, time is a question. And I think the next way to approach this for Lacan is the graph of desire, where time indeed is in a way formalized. And also the ontogenetical stages, or what is theorized in psychoanalysis, ontogenetical stages, is more explicitly thematized. But I think, I mean, when it comes down to the relationship of space and time in particular, I mean, I would really like to include time, but I haven't not yet found a formula, and I think Lacan has not found it either, because if you look into his last seminar, Topologie et le temps, there's not much there, actually. I mean, there are some interesting notes here and there, but does he say something substantial or consistent about the relationship of topology and time? I don't think so, or I haven't found it. So that's something I have no answer for. The second question, why is it necessary to formalize these two formalizations, or that which is the result or insight of those two formalizations? Because precisely by interrelating symbolic, imaginary, and real in a Borromean knot, you not only get the interdependence of those three registers, but also, as I said, the coinsage, the wedging, which is also something dynamical happening in the knotting itself, precisely as an object PTR. So by that, in that way, you show that our inability here to situate the object PTR nonetheless has to be inscribed in a formal way into our way of thinking about the imaginary. So the imaginary only holds if we at the same time have a theory of the object PTR in the end. And this is something which on a very brute level knot theory shows, I think. And then the question of, is there another impasse maybe of this formalization? I mean, yeah, I don't know, but I think there might be actually hints from Lacan saying that there is a new impasse emerging there. You know those also those quotes or these passages where he says j'ai échoué avec les nœuds, etc. So I don't know if this holds to the formal or determination of what we consider as a matheme, as a formalization of an impasse of a formalization. But certainly there is, I think, it's not just a meta theory of everything there is, but there is something, a process going on, and you reach a certain limit point in a way. That would be my tentative answer. I don't know if it's satisfactory.
The last question, Peter.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this. It was brilliant. So perhaps just a suggestion. You just said that Lacan doesn't have a theory, but when you said that the position of the viewer is somehow fixed, so it is limited, this applies to very famous apologue of free prisoners, because the viewer is also limited. He does see only just what's in front of him. So you should connect that with concave mirror experiment.
The panopticon, you mean? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, well, I consider that. Actually, there are many links popping up once one goes into this question of vision in, let's say, French philosophy or whatever. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, we'll take a break. Thank you.
Thank you.